it's my great honor to moderate this discussion, and I think it will be very valuable for all of us here. Just to start with, I need to tell you that probably the main reason, yes, why we are doing it now was the paper which Yuliia, Shaipova, and I presented last year. It is called Global South and Eastern Europe, Shared Legacies of Colonial Experiences. So it's I should say that this is a very important topic now in Ukraine. And also from my perspective, it is an important topic for the discussion between people of Ukraine and also people of the nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America. We had like small presentation in Poland last year, also with the participants from India and from South Africa, and also our Polish colleagues, so that to have this Eastern European perspective, not just Ukrainian perspective. Now we would like to talk once more, so 1 year passed, and also the reason is that we have now Ukrainian translation of this our text. So yeah, we wrote it at first in English and then in Ukrainian. And I would like to introduce our speakers. So my colleague, let me start. Yes, from my colleague Yuliia Shaipova, who is also affiliated expert at Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. We also have from India, Kavita Krishnan. She's an Indian author. Her book is upcoming just in a month. I think you will mention maybe it. Also feminist and human rights activist. We have Anabell Ramires from Ukrainian Institute. Anabell will tell more about the work of Ukrainian Institute also, which is connected and research connected to this topic. My name is Olha Vorozhbyt. I'm also an affiliated expert at Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism, and I will be your moderator today. So I think I would ask Yuliia to start maybe with really brief introduction of our paper, because Kavita and Anabell have seen it, but we have more viewers here, and I assume they haven't read it. So Yuliia, please could you introduce a little bit our this paper, and we will go on with discussion. So I think we will have 7 minutes for each speaker, and so please.
Yes, thank you, Olha. Hello, everyone. Once again, it's a great pleasure to have this event. Yes, so to start with the paper, our main objective was to try to see how the different legacies of overcoming colonial experiences interact in Central and Eastern Europe and also around the world, like in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And we were looking at different time periods of colonial and post-colonial experiences. So we both tried to see how colonial and imperial extraction happened like in a historic time frame, but we also wanted to look at how colonialism transformed into neo-colonialism and how the blunt, brutal extraction and control and coercion have shifted to more subtle forms of dependencies, codependencies, and influences, and seeing some countries through the lens, through the prism of still spheres of influence, although it seems that all these spheres of influence constants have stayed in the 20th century, but many colonial and neo-colonial powers still see some countries, some states as dependent on them, as being the rightful kind of circle of actors on which they should exercise influence and can exercise influence. We also tried to see different forms in which colonial practices and neo-colonial practices were expressed. So namely, it's not only about conquering one's land and extracting resources, although it's very obviously the main and basic way of conducting colonial post-colonial and imperial practices, but it's also about political influence on your political elite. It's also about economic relations and interrelations. It's also about soft power influences, right? It's about cultural relations and certain hierarchies that are formed in each of these spheres. And of course, now it's also about military presence in somebody's territory, so which makes some power dependent on the other. Yes, so it's this part that is more descriptive and analytical and based into looking into practices that exist. But then also an important part of our report is the consequences that which all these practices bear for countries that experienced colonial practices on behalf of other powers. And basically we tried to see who was successful or relatively successful in overcoming their relations of subordination. And here we have also 3 case studies. So one is on India, one is on Kenya, and one is on Ukraine. All of them have, of course, different experiences. It's not that every colonial or post-colonial experience is the same. Of course, they have all their own peculiarities, and some things happened in one country, some things didn't happen in another, and that's fine. But what is shared is that it's a history of oppression. But for example, if we take the case of India, it's understandable that nobody sees India as the sphere of British interests anymore, right? It's a sovereign, separate country, an independent one, and you would be frowned upon if you said that India is a British sphere of interest. But for some reason, it's still okay to say that, I don't know, Kazakhstan is in the sphere of Russian sphere of interests. So this is interesting to see how some countries were able to make this change, and some countries are still struggling with it. And of course, these perceptions rooted in sometimes in history, sometimes in present day times, how it influences the perception of other countries. I already mentioned Kazakhstan, but it is very often that even now in the Western media, you can see something like, oh, Kazakhstan is the backyard of Russia. And this is a certain perception, right, which is formed by the history of colonialism. And of course, it's not very welcomed by the Kazakh people, for example. And it is interesting how these hierarchies that were formed long time ago, how they form our perceptions now of whole nations, of whole peoples, of their level of development, of their capacities, and so on. And this is exactly why this report is so important, to show how our own biases may work against us, and for us to be able to understand better how to work with our own prisms, because obviously every nation, every people knows very well about their own struggles, but it is very often that we close our eyes or are blind, maybe not intentionally, but for the reason of not knowing enough about other people's struggles, that we remain unaware of how close actually our experiences are and how much we share and how much we might actually be biased against them. So in this vein, it is very important to try to see not only from the point of view of a great power that presents their own narrative of themselves and of the region and of the neighboring countries and of the colonies, for example, or former colonies, but also from the point of view of the people who actually were subjugated at some time, and to see their view on how it all happened. And that's exactly what we tried to do in our report.
Thank you, Yuliia. And I would like now to come to Kavita, yes, and to ask you, because you have, so we were writing with the case also of India, of Kenya, and then Ukraine, but you represent, and you researched also, as I know, this topic. Though I have the story, like personal story, like 10 years ago, I was talking to a young scholar from India, and he was researching as his PhD at that time, post-colonialism, and I asked him, what do you know about Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Europe? And he said, well, I read something, but this is like, we don't have many information about that. And I would like to ask you, how is it now? Because mainly, yes, if we research post-colonial studies, they are focused on overseas colonies and research on them. But since the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine, I think the process started. So how is it in India? Is the perspective somehow changed? Is it also somehow now more views on Eastern Europe, not only Ukraine, but Eastern Europe and also Central Asia in studies of post-coloniality?
Well, I don't know about contemporary academic studies in the past 3 or 4 years, but I will say that overall, I think there is a resistance in India traditionally among, even among scholars of Russian and East European studies to actually recognize the experience of Eastern Europe as a colonial experience. The reason is, I think, because there's supposed to be a sort of Soviet interregnum, and that is complicated by the fact that and I think that to begin with, I should clarify where I stand. And I think that colonialism, as Yuliia also said, there's an immense diversity there. The point is that there are certain characteristics which you can say, define as colonial, the experience of colonialism. So there's settler colonialism, genocide, and total population replacement. There's extracting, primitive extraction, and then other more sophisticated forms of extraction, extractive economies. Then there's post assimilation, and there's this civilizing sort of civilizing mission or a modernizing mission, uplift. There's racial and ethnic hierarchies. Then there's apartheid, which is a very specific kind of thing. So I think that there are so many experiences, and to say, to do a gatekeeping and say that such and such is not, they have no business claiming to have a colonial experience. I think that that is absolutely wrong. And what is the more interesting question? The interesting question is not, oh, is it colonial, is it not? The interesting question is, what are the combinations of experiences which are, from which you can identify different kinds of colonialisms. And also the important question is how it affects modern day politics, your perception of yourself, right? So just as in Eastern Europe, for instance, in Ukraine, there may be a new interest in, asserting the idea and studying the idea of being a post-colonial entity, right? In India, I would say that there's also, of course, there is that perception, but there's also a parallel politics and a dominant politics today to not think of yourself as post-colonial, to say we are independent. And which is why I would, sort of be very wary even of what your paper sees about India, because I think that in saying that we have overcome a colonial experience and now we are all above that, what that does is, and especially in contemporary politics, it's to say that the colonial experience means it's Western influences and, it's modernity basically. And now we are this Hindu nation, emerging Hindu nation, and we are giving up all that. And of course, we are independent, right? So I think that is an interesting thing to look at. And in your post-colonial politics means that you're also criticizing, you're able to have a democratic critique of a post-colonial government, right? A post-colonial nation, post-colonial state, let me put it that way, post-colonial state. And that you do, you also recognize there's colonial hangovers in policing or in different ways of organizing social organization and so on. But you're also able to claim democracy and modernity for yourself. Now, I think I'm close to the end of my time. But I just want to say vis-a-vis Eastern Europe and the, the sense of comparisons or solidarity. I think that really one should look today at the experience as being um, actually look at the impact of that experience on your politics today. And we can very clearly see in Eastern Europe. Of course, India's relationship is different because the British Empire was not next door, right? So it was never about, the British Empire was never about assimilating India. It was not an assimilationist politics. They didn't want to say, oh, you have to say you're British. They had to say, no, you are not us. You are not us. Whereas the Russian experience was to say, you are us. There's no you. You are just us. There's only us. It's a very different kind of experience of colonialism. And so Ukrainian politics today, from what I observe, I think it is, and my attempt is to really center in Indian understanding the experience of Ukrainian democracy. And to say that, you see, it's not that Belarus and Kazakhstan are somehow, oh, they are just, they are not voluntary spheres of influence. But the point is that their politics has been, so shaped by the Russian Soviet experience as well. So you had the empire, and then you had various empires in Eastern Europe. So not only Russian, but Habsburg, all of that, Ottoman. And then you have the Soviet, you have the Russian Empire, and you have the Soviet period, which says that there's a democratic relationship among republics. But what it's done is that there was no democracy then. And then post, when there's a new nation state, no democracy has been, so it's all single leader states. And those states are seeing themselves as modeling themselves on Russia, right? That's the difference between the state and the people. The people obviously would, may not see themselves that way. They may want to, there may be a struggle to, to define a national identity differently. But for Ukraine, it's been about saying, if Russia wants to say you become Belarus and Kazakhstan, go to that status. And Ukraine has had a tumultuous democracy experience. And it is shaped by that. And in democracy, not everything is good. There is also a politics of, so what is the relationship with Russia in terms and with Ukrainian politics? So Ukrainian nationalism, national identity is and how it perceives its experience there with, language politics, with, the experience of democracy and how economic, it's not extractive exactly, but now, even Ukrainian corruption is inseparable from the issue of Russian economic dominance and influence, right? So I would say to Indians, to sum up my observation, I would say to Indians that look at our politics and think about how it has shaped, our past has shaped our present, the colonial past. So in terms of language politics in India, which is very much there, so it's a post-colonial politics of Hindi dominance, but there's also even Hindi dominance has come about as a result of anti-Western, anti-English, all of that politics. So you see that happening. You see various kinds of religious majoritarianisms. Is it going to be a secular nationalism? Is it going to be an anti-colonial nationalism? Is it going to be Hindu nationalism? And in Ukraine too, you can see that in terms of opposing dominance, will it become, there are certain forms of chauvinist politics. There are other forms of people engaging with democratic politics and saying that to be Ukrainian is not to be chauvinist nationalism, it is an anti-colonial nationalism. And I think that is the thing that India and Ukraine would have in common, that there is a possibility of, see, in all the, people ask about, for instance, Central Europe or Western European countries. So I always say that, you see, nationalism in the countries that have once been empires, and I don't mean Central Europe here, I do mean the Western European empires or, or are today empires. Those countries, nationalist politics is about becoming that empire again. You can't. But their whole, British nationalism is about saying, oh, Brexit, because we are this great British nation and we want to be Britain, Great Britain again. Point is, you're not going to get India back. You're not going to become that again. But nationalism there is always that kind of a very it represents a certain kind of racial and other kinds of power and nostalgia for that power. It is not. Whereas in India and Ukraine, there is a possibility of a democratic nationalism, which is a nationalism of resistance to uh, which is resistance to certain forms of power and domination, and about how you find your identity in your kind of democracy, in really finding out how do we engage in a new way with different problems that we have, which are also, some of them are partly, they are mediated by colonialism, like language, region, etc. I think
Yeah.
that's what my point is. Yeah.
Thank you, Kavita. Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting point, and I would like now to go, and we will. I think we will have questions to what you and Yuliia said, but I would like now to ask Anabell Ramires from the Ukrainian Institute. This is the public institution in Ukraine which works with Ukrainian culture, because for us culture was also one of the instruments of Russian colonial politics, and stays now as alas. And I would like to ask Anabell about the issue of colonial legacy and which role it plays in the relations between Ukraine and countries of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and in your work with those countries, if I may.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I guess it's a brief presentation of what Ukrainian Institute does, especially the department I work in. So our main goal is to pretty much develops the relationships with countries Ukraine were historically not very visible in. So in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but not all the regions, several countries chosen for now, which are South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. So my experience is based only on those countries, and the practical input I have is coming from the working with these countries. And pretty much when we started, so the department work started in 2023, the end of 2023. And since our society was very engaged in the topic of post-colonialism, and for us, we were considering a lot questions like language, cultural appropriation, erased histories. We were talking a lot about monopolization of our narratives. And so it was very natural for us when we started to kind of assume that the colonial experience would automatically become a very strong common ground. But what in practice turned out was a very much like a much more nuanced situation, and depending on the region, we were facing different reactions to where we were engaging in this topic. For example, in African countries we worked in, it was noticeable that topic of colonialism still remains like active lens from which everything else is being understood, and the conversations we were holding were like a lot of times coming to this topic particularly. But for example, in Latin America, it was less of an issue, and the conversations, especially for example in Mexico, came more often to the topic of neocolonialism, like the economic dependency of now, of media influences, of dominance of United States, like contemporary asymmetries, which sometimes have like nothing to do with their colonial experiences of previous century. And as Kavita mentioned, we also noticed that in India, for example, first, what we see is that colonial history is the foundation for understanding the country when we just start the communication, but actually it's not the primary language when we start the conversation, because then it's just such a different experience. So we like the more we speak about shared things, the more distance we actually create. So this kind of paradox was something that we noticed. Another thing we noticed was also kind of it depended on whom we were speaking to. So like what kind of institution we were working with in a very specific project. So, for example, it's mm, it's a thing we generalize. I don't usually tend to generalize, but this is something we notice like in a lot of countries, that when we speak to governmental institutions about the projects we do, we speak through the lens of heritage, multiculturalism, national identity, cultural preservations, and there the lens of colonialism becomes like an intermediary to talk about these topics. But when we, for example, talk with independent actors, independent artists, or independent cultural institutions, so they usually need for connect something more, I don't know, immediate. So really talking about environmental crisis, about economic dependencies, censorships, gender inequalities, urban inequalities. So topics that maybe sometimes are not addressed even by their own governments. And so here, this was the thing. So when we were starting to put the question of colonial legacies, like common colonial legacies, into place, the conversation was actually like not falling apart, but much more hard to achieve. And I think it is also important to share the experience we had in some African countries with some of the agents we were collaborating. So the complicated situation is because Europe is highly associated with colonial power. And since Ukraine is speaking a lot about that we are a part of Ukraine, so we create a very interesting contradiction. Europe, yes, yes, sorry. Yeah. So when we are saying that, there is like a bit of skeptical attitude when we start to say that Ukraine was colonized because of that Europe is associated with a force that actually was colonizing. So we need to start with a very, very basic. When we just share of how do we, as Ukrainians, see how our culture was absorbed by Russian culture, how actually Russian imperialism functioned for us, and how that perception makes sense in our situation, and only then maybe come to speak about some shared experiences. So this is like just some risks we were facing, and that I found interesting to share here. I guess also it is like important to mention that we prefer to go through topics, very specific topics that might be um, um, working as this common ground, because we have either common or different but interesting to share ways of how we treat those topics, especially when we talk about monopolization of narratives. In each country, it works in a different way, but it is something that gives a very rich conversation, especially when artists start working together. So unequal visibility is also something that is the point of meeting. Dependencies, as I mentioned before. So yeah, I guess that it's just a more organic way for us to go through themes rather than just starting with a topic of post-colonialism, just because of this multiple and very diverse experiences, also as Kavita had mentioned. So I guess this is the main thing I wanted to share for the beginning. So it's just for us very important to like not assume that we are close, but actually to build step by step, you know, this closeness on the topics that are relatable. And I guess the last one is that what we started to notice recently is in a cultural sphere a very strong demand for the direct like south to south dialogue. So the countries we work in really want to have a dialogue between each other, but without a dominant intermediary from Western countries. And so Ukraine is not automatically in that space of conversation. And for us, it is like, since we are very aware of it, we just want to try and to be integrated in that dialogue. So yeah, thank you very much.
Is Ola with us? Or is there a problem with the connection?
We might have lost her, but I just wanted to actually quickly react to what you both said, because it's such a fascinating topic in general, and I just wanted to circle back to what Kavita was saying about defensive and offensive nationalism, and I think it's a very important distinction that is very often missed, especially in the West. We often assume that from the point of view of, I don't know, the US or Britain or France, when we talk about nationalism, we perceive it as something bad. Because, of course, those powers are ex-empires and still maintaining some neo-colonial tendencies. And when there is a surge in nationalism in these countries, it doesn't look very well. But for countries like Ukraine, who were oppressed for years, for decades, it is like our nationalism is a defensive one. So it's our nationalism is expressed in the form we are a nation and we want to exist. So it's a very different thing from what ex-imperial powers are displaying. And to circle back to what Anabell was saying, that there is no immediate bond, and it is very true, and it is very rarely perceived so that we here in Eastern Europe have similar experiences. But I also think it's important not to turn it into like a contest of suffering, because it is something that's often happening when different people from different countries and different cultures start questioning each other's pains and saying like, oh, but how many people died in your war, or how many people died during your oppression? And I think the right approach, and what we try to cultivate in our report as well, is to try to show that all suffering matter, all pain matters, and we all can bond through it and understand each other better through our experiences. And I see Olha is back with us.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm very sorry. Something happened to my connection, but now I am back. And actually, this was the question I wanted to ask you. And also, I do agree. But I think Kavita told us that such nations, those nations that had this colonial legacy as those who were oppressed, so they have the chance for for nationalism which is democratic, and I think this is what we are trying also to build here, and we have what we have, for example, in the Baltic states and also in other Eastern European countries, countries of Eastern Europe that fueled on itself its suppression. And I would like Yuliia to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on, from your perspective also, while we were working on the research. So why we have so much disconnected narratives on post-colonialism and colonial legacies between like us in Ukraine and also in other countries of Eastern Europe and maybe also Central Asia and the countries of like South Asia, Latin America and Africa?
Yes, good question. And I think there are two main reasons. So the first one is that colonialism that we experienced is rather different from the overseas colonialism of Western powers. So first of all, land empires as Russia, they expand not to some very distant overseas territory, but just expanding through their existing borders, right? And the consequence of it is the people whom they colonize, they're not that different from themselves, meaning, of course, we are different nations and so on, but it's not a different race, it's not a different ethnicity, and hence it is hard to perceive the colonized people as really colonized. And it also creates a certain gap in perception, because when, I don't know, Britain colonized the Caribbean, let's say, so their colonial attitude towards the other, right? It was like, you are the other, you are lesser than us, and this is the basis of our superiority. You are different, you will never be the same. But for colonialism of Russia against Ukraine, it was, you are similar and you are just the wrong version of Russians. So you're basically just an incorrect Russian, and you do not exist. And whenever we talk about all the cultural possessions that were appropriated, looted, stolen, and now are exhibited, for example, in Western museums, they're still labeled, for example, as something from Syria or something from Nigeria. And of course, they should belong to their respective countries and peoples, but you still remain distinct. Whereas in our case, this proximity in religion, in race, in ethnicity, it all created the opportunity to say it's actually ours. You don't even exist. There is no such thing as Ukrainian. It's just, you know, some sort of Russian. It's a dialect of Russian, and it's a very distinct challenge in itself, very, very different from what people who experienced overseas colonialism have experienced. So that was one reason, different way of conducting colonialism. And of course, the second reason for colonialization of Central and Eastern Europe not perceived that way is the image that Russia built around their posture as anti-colonial, anti-imperial power during the Soviet times. So when the Soviet Union supported, I don't know, movements in the African continent for independence, of course, for many African countries and people, Russia is someone who is pioneering anti-imperialism, right? But that's what I was saying about before, that we very often, due to the lack of knowledge about each other, we just do not understand that they conducted anti-imperial policies, for example, in Africa, but very much imperial in their own near abroad, how they like to call it, right? And also that the Soviet Union, for as much as an empire of evil as it was, but it still was comprised of different countries and peoples, and many of the like anti-colonial movements were supported from within Ukraine itself. So we were pioneers in the UN in terms of supporting the dismantling of the apartheid regime, and we trained many of the independence fighters from South Africa in the territory of the south of Ukraine, but of course it all influences our perceptions, and it's very difficult for many people to see Russia for what it is towards people that it formerly colonized, when the global image is that, oh, we are helping fight the Western imperialism, but in the end it's more or less the same colonialism, but just in disguise. And what Anabell also mentioned, that, for example, for Latin America, it's not about colonialism like historically, but about neocolonialism now from the United States. And for many Ukrainians, it's also hard to understand, because we do not experience that much of the same thing. We are much farther from the US, right? And Russia is a far bigger problem for us. So that's why it's, when you have not experienced something firsthand, it's always hard to understand it. in the same way as many people have not experienced, I don't know, any colonial attitude from Russia, so they don't see it as much of a problem as people here or in Poland or in Moldova do. So that's exactly why it's important to talk and see different perspectives and how different people see their own neighbors and great powers which are influencing their regions in one way or another.
Thank you, Yuliia. Yuliia mentioned about neocolonialism, and this is what I would like to ask you, Kavita. So, due to Indian experience in history, has it enabled India to see and to recognize neocolonial practices better, especially in Indian society, but also in governments?
So I think just before I come to that, I just have a couple of some things which I found really interesting, and I wanted to respond to in what both Anabell and Yuliia said. Yuliia just mentioned, both of you mentioned Africa and the perception of their colonial experience and their inability to really see then that maybe that we have something in common with Ukraine. Instead, Russia is seen as the ally. So I think one of the things which look at how it affects politics in African countries today, some countries at least, where there's a blindness to the ability to see Russia's direct, primitive extractivism in Africa right now, right? Which it does by backing certain kinds of military leadership, certain kinds of leaders, offering protection, essentially a protection racket. And it is so, I see that and I tell people in India, there goes the East India Company. This is the East India Company model, okay? The colonial experience changed when the East India Company was replaced directly by the state. But I said, well, what the Wagner Group was doing in, some of the Sahel countries is extremely like what the East India Company, and it is also meddling in the politics there. So the idea that it is only the West which is interfering or meddling in the name of democracy, I mean, all of which, of course, happens, all of which there is a still neo-colonial structures between, say, France and Sahel countries. I mean, even now, fine, fair enough. But the point is that there are also other kinds of, relationships with big powers which are developing today, to which, one cannot be blind, right? The other thing was I was thinking about comparisons and thinking with great interest about, for instance, my book, which Ola mentioned, which is to come out, is on de-democratization, which challenges the idea of West versus West and is talking about how the idea of multipolarity is actually disguising and legitimizing a de-democratization across the world, in the West and the West. Something which is led by far right in America and Europe, as well as Russia and China, and of course Modi regime and all of that. So my interest in that was that you look at how So I talk about solidarity without polarity. Okay, so if you look at the Palestinian experience and Ukraine, okay, there's actually ways in which, if without arguing over the precise nature of what is colonial, what is not, right? Basically, if you look at the problem as a country's existence being denied, immediately you can see the comparison between, we will not acknowledge that Palestine exists. We don't acknowledge that there's any such thing as a Ukrainian identity, national identity. Look at how common that is in the discourse, right? So if you look at the discourse of the powerful there is that. On the other hand, I've seen, we've seen in the immediate wake of October 7th and all of that, I've seen Ukrainian responses also try to say, oh, look, Israel's right to exist is always in danger. It's next door to these hostile countries. And that's how, our relationship with Russia is. Look, Israel, you're like us. But then that changed. That is completely a false perception, right? The right to exist of Ukraine and of Palestine is actually what is in question, what is actually under attack, what is actually being denied. So that could be the relationship which is the basis then for solidarity, which is completely divided now. That those who support Palestine completely support Russia in Ukraine, and often vice versa, right? What you asked about India, I think in India the bigger problem right now, and to which I would say that in any dialogue on the basis of colonial experience, you have to be very, very alert to that. For instance, in Ukraine, you said about cultural nationalism being so important because it was a colonization of assimilation in a big way, right? Of a denial of identity. And in India, cultural nationalism has often had a strong element of denying that we had any problems in our own country at all. Okay, so you deny any pre-colonial hierarchies and you defend all pre-colonial hierarchies, which is defensive, but it's not, it becomes defensive of all the worst practices you ever had. So anybody who is coming up with critiques on the basis of gender or caste or all those things is basically told that, or communalism, is told that you are actually pro-colonial or you are pro-Western right now. So in speaking to India, I think the commonality based on cultural nationalism specifically has to be discussed and avoided. Okay, to actually, bring that elephant in the room and say, hello, it's very different. And sure, so the critique of that and understanding that, and the commonalities have to be seen in how you perceive yourself today, where India as a state and many Indians want to see themselves like Russia. They want to see themselves as a potential big power. So just as, whereas Ukraine's wish to see itself as part of Europe is, I think, a little different. It is not trying to align with power. It is trying to distance itself from a very intrusive power and try to say, okay, we want to be somewhere where the possibility of our democratic existence is alive, which is why I bring it down to democracy today in post-colonial politics and, post-empire politics, both for empires, former empires, as well as for former colonies. That the ability, the space to actually explore your democracy, your democratic potential, to what extent, you're fighting for that. That is what we should be fighting for. And you should be fighting against anything that is suppressing that and denying that, So that makes for a nationalism of resistance to, current colonialism as well, which is like Russia's violent colonial grab. So there is a way then to be alert to make sure that that doesn't come into anti-Russian chauvinism and all of that in where you are. I think that many Ukrainians are alert to that, those with whom I have interacted, certainly.
Thank you, Kavita. Well, that's my feeling after our last visit to India as well, alas. And we have just we have a guest here, Maria. I don't know. Do you have question? If you do not have question, I will continue because we have 10 minutes. So if you have question to the guests, you can ask. If not, then we will continue. I have one more question also to Anabell, and then we will wrap up our discussion. So, yeah, I think Maria just listening. So my last question will be to Anabell, and then we will try to wrap up. So because I was the co-author of one of the researches we conducted for the Ukrainian Institute in India, and also you had similar research on the cultural landscape, yes, of countries in Latin America and in Asia. So what, which, and in our research, we devoted special attention also to the colonialism legacy. How was it with other researchers, and was this issue also important and also like highlighted by other authors?
Yeah, sure. This is the like a topic recurring in each of the investigations we have, in each research. The question would be again, what is the consequence, like what do we do in terms of practical cultural projects with this information? How do we approach the topic so it doesn't create this kind of distance I mentioned in the first part of um, like of when I was answering the question. So I guess I would just quickly also take on the things that Yuliia said about the feeling experiences on the first hand. And because of that, like having a bit of more yeah, distance and not being that available to actually understand the experience, but for me it's also even more, since it's not just the fact that the experience was not felt, but it's also because of the whole narratives and that Russia is inserting in the country. So it is like double obstacles, the distance and the propaganda. And we find the most interesting in terms of this topic for our for this year and for the next year is to actually decolonize the Soviet legacy in those countries. So actually to separate in communication campaigns and maybe in cultural projects, what was done by Ukrainians that was told was done by Russians, and just to give this knowledge. And then we don't expect it immediately to work as a bonding point, but at least the information presence in the field, like, it is very important. For example, what you mentioned about apartheid is not that well known in South Africa. So same in each country we're working in, there is some presence of some trace of Ukrainians that were helping in building either buildings or systems or supporting the processes inside those countries that we want to underline, and we feel like it's a huge thing that we are missing right now, as well as history information of our countries, because what we know is that colonizing countries tend to be well studied in terms of their history. So we all well know like the histories of the big powers, but we don't really know the histories of the countries. And same is said about Ukraine. So when we come, for example, to Argentina, some people might know about the history of Ukraine because of the diaspora that was there and was sharing this, but people who were not directly in touch with Ukrainian descendants in Argentina don't know like almost anything about the Ukrainian history. So this is something we also are working on in terms of like a goal, yeah, to translate as many history books as possible, especially those that are very available for general public, because we see that as a point where curiosity comes as a starting point of the conversation. And we also here believe that it's bilateral. So to kind of talk about Indian experience, South African experience, Mexican experience here in Ukraine more. So actually people here also aware of how different our yeah, situations are. And I guess the last thing is that when we talk about nationalism, when we talk about colonialism, it is so easy to be for those terms to be weaponized against us in the conversations. That's what we saw so many times, and that's why for us it is very important to give artists, because we are talking about cultural diplomacy, right? So we are talking about cultural projects where it is possible to put artists together in a room and to give them the possibility to find the third ground in which they both stand. So it's kind of, we trust that each artist can bring their own experience on the country, and to use terms that aren't that easy to be played against you, you know. So just experience that are more personal.
Thank you. Well, yeah, that's really important, very important approach. So, okay, we have 2 minutes. I just need, because we have 1 hour for the discussion, so I will try to wrap up. Many thanks to all of you for your valuable presentations, answers, and this, I think, very important discussion we had. And what I would like to maybe stress at the end, I think the issue of democracy in cooperation and in bilateral interaction between the countries and between the societies is really important. This is what Kavita said. And I think, Yuliia, you remember that during our presentation in Warsaw, there was there was an issue concerning the democracy perception in the countries of Africa, and that many of respondents, so the youngsters, so they answered that they would like to live under democracy, and that is why perceiving that this topic of democracy is so much important in interactions between different nations that had this experience of colonial legacy. And I think that this finalization and conclusion to our discussion is what we can elaborate in the future, and what we can share with the society, with government, and other important.
Can I just
Kavita.
Can I just make one quick suggestion in light of what you're saying? I think that, for instance, today, if the way in which labor flows and labor exploitation is a major form of neocolonialism today, then even looking and acknowledging Russia's role in literally trafficking and coercing workers from all global South countries to fight in the Russian army against Ukraine today. I mean, that ought to be something we stress today as a shared experience today, to see what an empire actually does and to make Russian racism actually visible, you know.
Yes.
Which it otherwise people assume that, oh, Ukrainians are also white. But, so I think making that racism visible, all of that, that's something practical that we could do in these conversations today.
Yes, that's true. And recently we had presentations about that, but I will stop maybe on this. I can share, and our colleague Maria Tomak, she can share with you the research they've done on that. So I think we will finish on this note, on this final sentence. And once more, thank you to everyone who came today to this discussion. Thank you, Kavita. Thank you, Anabell, Yuliia, and Yehor. Thank you to our listeners. And there will be the recording, so everyone who wants will be able to listen to it. And one more just moment, there was another speaker who wanted to attend, but he could not do that, and he sent me his paper. I will share it with you. It is about the common understanding of hunger and Holodomor, so famine in Ukraine and in India, and I think this is also an important historical bond. I will share it, and maybe we will also attach it, if he agrees, to the video and publish it either on our website or So Dr. Sharma, we noticed and we had your paper, so sorry that you could not be here with us today. So thank you. Yeah, see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.